So for me, classics beyond whiteness means challenging this narrative that's dominated for centuries, that there is some monolithic Western civilization that originated in the ancient Greeks and Romans, and instead recognizing the influence of Near Eastern cultures, among other things, and just unpacking the historical, socio-political factors that allowed that narrative of Western civilization to find purchase in the first place. And as for what I try to do in my classes to think about classics beyond whiteness is, I think the clearest area to think about this is the main civilization course that I teach, which is on predominantly 5th century Athens. And one thing that I try to do there, particularly when looking at the conflict between the Greeks and Persians, is to encourage students to really not take what Herodotus or any other historian, not take what they say for granted, but think about, well, what did this look like from the Persian side, for example? Because when you take that view, then this monumental event in Greek history emerges as this tiny little blip in the empire that was ancient Persia. So it allows this radically different perspective on this thing that, to the Greeks at least, was this was sort of the high point of their civilization. So that's one concrete example of how I try to think about classics beyond whiteness in my classes.
Hi, I'm Dr. Hides. I'm postdoctoral fellow in the classics department. To me, classics beyond whiteness is about trying to make up for a lot of damage that has been done historically in our field. When classics was founded, really when the university system in the United States was founded, the education that was being provided was centered around the Greek and Roman world. And as a result of that, the sort of people that classics was understood to be for, the sort of people who deserved to have that knowledge, were the sort of people that the university system was designed for. It was rich white men. And of course, the university system has changed dramatically and it continues to change in really important ways, but classics needs to catch up. And so much of what we teach, of how our courses are designed, of who we see in the classroom, who feels welcome in the classroom, still has traces of that old system. Classics is complicit, has been complicit with white supremacy, with colonialism, imperialism, art theft, anti-Semitism, all of these really awful, damaging practices that have caused real and lasting harm to people of color, students, scholars, authors. So to me, the idea of classics beyond whiteness is trying to do whatever we can to recenter the voices of people who are not part of that original, exclusive demographic, and that especially means people of color. And the way that I've been trying to promote this idea in my classroom and on campus has manifested itself in the series that THM, Geller-Goad, and I have organized, which is trying to recenter these voices of people of color through various media. So we've got guest lectures, we're going to do a film screening of Chirac, we had a reading group on Donna Zuckerberg's Not All Dead White Men. And what I'm most excited about is we've commissioned new art, new painted portraits of Black classicists from the 18th, 19th centuries who up until now their contributions to the field have been completely forgotten and completely erased. And so we have a local artist named Leo Rucker, who's affiliated with Old Salem, who is painting portraits of, for example, Helen Maria Chestnut, who wrote the first Latin textbook. It was called A Road to Latin, that was ever published by an African-American woman. Charlotte Hawkins Brown, who transformed a one-room schoolhouse for Black students in North Carolina into a junior college, despite extreme opposition, white supremacist opposition from the North Carolina state government. And Wiley Lane, who was the first Black professor of Greek at Howard University. And we're really excited to have these portraits as a sort of a permanent fixture in our department so that students of color who do not see themselves represented in the faculty of our department, at least not yet, that's something that I hope will change soon, who probably won't see themselves represented to a very large extent in the canon of authors that we are reading or scholars that are writing about these authors, at least if we're looking at any sort of work that was done before the last 20 or 30 years. They'll see themselves represented physically in paint as a really essential part of the history of the field. And this is not a history that we are creating now, it's one that we're recovering. It has been actively erased by, as a result of this entrenchment of the idea that classics is of, by, and for white people alone. That idea is wrong, it is harmful, and we really want to change it. We want to make students of color feel welcome to study classics, to see that they are an important part of its history, and hopefully to encourage them, if they so desire, to be a part of its future.
So, classics beyond whiteness to me really means three separate but connected things. And the first has to do with a recognition of what the ancient world actually looks like. That is, the idea that Greeks and Romans, and that the Greek-speaking world and the Roman world are full of white people, is simply not true. And telling the story that way is the result of all kinds of actual misconceptions, right? So first it's just a question of recognizing the ethnic reality of the ancient world, which is that we are not dealing with anything which makes sense as a European cultural patrimony when you talk about the Mediterranean world. And the second thing is, I guess, meta-scholarly. And the second thing has to do with turning the lens not only on antiquity, but on the way that we as modern people tell stories about antiquity. And I think a lot of students come into the study of the ancient world with the assumption that there is consensus about what the ancient world looks like. It's really important, I think, to make people aware at an early stage that all of this is contested, all of it is contestable, and therefore all the stories that we tell about the ancient world reflect our own preoccupations and our own concerns. So we need to spend time in the classroom, I think, dissecting not only what the ancient world looks like, but what it says about modern scholars when they tell stories about the ancient world in a certain way. And the third thing, I would say, is a concern really for people who are in the profession of the study of antiquity, and that involves widening the ambit of what we call classics, a designation that implies there is a certain special position within the study of the ancient world for the Greco-Roman literatures and languages and histories, widening this to include a much broader ancient world, and widening the classics department to include more scholars who aren't white, since the field itself is overwhelmingly white. So I think it's not only easy, but essential to make some of these concerns topics of discussion within classics classrooms. And I really think that classics professors are doing everybody a disservice, but most of all their students, in glossing over the necessity of doing this. So something that I've tried to do in the myth course I'm teaching, for example, is to put the focus on not only what we think we know about the ancient world, but on the knowledge production processes that have resulted in us thinking what we know about the ancient world. So